We travel to Syria for Human Rights Watch. You've been to Turkey as well. We've seen the violent clashes around Taksim Square last May and June. A boy was hurt during those clashes, Berkin Elvan, and you spoke to his parents in the summer, last summer, when he was still in a coma. Let's have a look.
Kahvaltılık için Berkin ekmek almaya geliyor. Pazar günü sabah. Fırınla evimizin arası zaten normalde 2 dakika. 2 dakikalık bir yer. Çocuk gidiş o gidiş, daha geri dönüşü yok. Hastanede buluyor kendini. 14 yaşında bir çocuk. Oyun çağında. Şu an hastanede çok zor yaşam mücadelesi veriyor. Çok zor şartlar altında.
Yeah, he was still fighting for his life at that time. He's died this week, and again demonstrations and again police violence. Have you spoken to his parents since he died?
My colleagues have, and you know, this was again one of those cases that stood out, but it was not the only case. What happened last year was that the authorities tried to develop a park in the middle of Istanbul. There were a lot of protests. The government responded by cracking down brutally, which spurred more protests. So, and part of the problem was that the government, the security forces, were using a lot of tear gas, and they were firing tear gas canisters directly at people, which they're not supposed to do, and in some cases injuring very severely. And what we believe happened was that Berkin was also hit by one of these canisters. And we documented tens of cases like that. And unfortunately, since then, even though there have been statements by the government, by the authorities, that they would investigate, we haven't seen any kind of accountability and no new guidelines on this particular issue, the use of tear gas canisters shot directly at people.
It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, if you look at it from afar, it seems that all over the world, protests are popping up constantly, and you're hopping from one conflict to another. And do you feel there's a connection, or something is happening that fuels these protests, or what is your take on that?
I think in some cases that there is a level of contagion. You know, I think we definitely saw it in the Arab Spring, where what happened in Tunisia then spread to Egypt and Libya and eventually to Syria, and perhaps has inspired demonstrations in other places as well. But I also think that in most cases, these conflicts, these clashes have their own dynamics, their own reasons in many cases. And so while there are some similarities and perhaps some contagion, they're also different. Unfortunately, what we see in many cases is that the authorities react to these demonstrations with violence and by committing human rights violations, and that's what we're there to document and try to stop.
And what is it that drives you then? Indignation, anger, love for humankind?
I think it is a combination of different things. I think it is really about giving voice to the people who can't speak for themselves. The government in these cases will always be able to present their case. Why was it necessary to use violence? As Assad was saying, these people were terrorists, that they've been killed. That's not always the truth. And I think somebody needs to stand up and say that and document it, and in a proper way, to make sure that these kinds of allegations are not
taken for granted.
For granted, exactly.
What's your next destination?
Well, we're following Ukraine very closely.